Today on Let Them Talk TV, have I got a treat for you? You're going to learn how to speak Middle English. Yes, that's right. We're going back to the Middle Ages, to the late 14th century to be precise. A time when life was simpler. No smartphones, no internet, no AI slop. A time when you fetched water from the well and you churned your own butter. A time when the only thing you really needed to worry about was the plague. Yes, that's right. Today we're going to party like it's 1399. As you can imagine, not many people know Middle English these days. I certainly don't. So I had a choice. Either find a 650-year-old Englishman or ask the brilliant Kevin Stroud from the History of English podcast. I chose the latter. So here he is. Well met, Kevin.
Hi, Gideon. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing
Great
fine.
to be here.
Yeah, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you here today. I just thought we'd start with some Middle English greetings. I use well met. Was that a common one back in the time?
Yeah, well met was common. Hail was common. A lot of the greetings that we have today are modern. You think about the word hello, right? That's a very simple, basic greeting, but it's really a modern greeting. It's only been around in the modern period and mostly from the 20th century. But there were earlier versions of it that you could have found. You could have found the word like hallowed, which was an early version. It basically, I think Geoffrey Chaucer is the first one who used it in one of his early poems, but it certainly would have been around by then. It's a word that actually evolved into our word holler, which is common at least in the southern part of the United States. If you yell at somebody, you holler at them. And that's what it originally meant. It meant to get someone's attention. You yelled at them. Well, the word evolved over time, and it eventually, within American English, evolved into the word hello. But the word itself actually does have its origins, ultimate origins, in Middle English as a way of getting someone's attention.
We're going to return to some Middle English vocabulary and some pronunciation. But first, you could tell the listeners about your podcast.
Sure. Well, the History of English podcast is a chronological history of the English language. So I've been doing it now. The first episodes were released in 2012, so I've been doing it for about 13 years. And it's now up to, I think, 180 some episodes. So it's pretty thorough in its history. And as I said, it is chronological. So it actually begins before English. We begin with what's called the Proto-Indo-European language, which was the ancient ancestor of English and was the ancient ancestor of most modern European languages. So the podcast traces the history out from there. And I say it's about 50% language and about 50% history. I try to maintain an overall historical narrative to keep it interesting, because I realize that talking about English sound changes and grammatical developments, it can get a little bit boring and tedious if you're not careful. So trying to tie it into a historical narrative, I think, keeps it a little bit more interesting for listeners.
Yeah. I can confirm it's absolutely fascinating. And I'll put a link in the description to anyone who's interested. Do check it out. But while listening, today we're focusing on Middle English, but from listening to your podcast, I know that you also do readings in Old English. So you've learnt Old English and Middle English. How did you go about doing that?
Well, I wouldn't say that I've completely learned Old English, because Old English is really almost like a foreign language. It didn't sound like modern English. The grammar was different. The vocabulary was actually quite different. So it takes an effort to learn Old English. But I learned quite a bit about Old English in doing the podcast. And, I'm an avid reader and book collector. So through the years, any resource I've been able to track down and find related to Old English and Middle English and the way, words were pronounced and the sound changes and vowel shifts. I really researched that and tried to keep track of it. And also through the years, trying to find any recordings that I can find in Old English and Middle English. And there are not a lot. I mean, you alluded to that earlier. there really is limited evidence available for how the language was pronounced in the past. But through the years, I've tried to collect as many samples as I can, and they're not always consistent in the way they represent sounds, but comparing the research and the scholarship and trying to piece it all together. And as I said, scholars will still debate over what the precise, sound of the short A sound in Middle English was. But I think you can, and there would have been variation at the time as well. But when I do readings in Old English and Middle English, I'm just trying to provide an example for listeners, because that's really one of the main benefits of a podcast. You can't really get that by reading a book. But if you can hear what the language sounded like, I think it really connects you to that period of English, and you can hear the evolution. You can hear how we got from Beowulf, which is the most well-known text in Old English, to modern English that we speak today.
Okay, well, my next question follows on from that. For the uninitiated, when was Middle English precisely?
Yeah, language is constant. Sure, that's what I was getting ready to say. Yeah. The language is always evolving. So there's no point at which you wake up one morning and everyone says, oh, well, now we're speaking Middle English. No, it didn't happen that way. But historical linguists would say that around the year 1100, 1150, somewhere in that range, the Middle English period began. And it ran until, the 1500s. So we have about a 400-year period of time. And, sometimes people say, well, what is Middle English? But obviously it's something in the middle. It's between Old English and Modern English. But the way I like to think about language is that there are really three main components to language. There's the vocabulary that we use, our words. There's the way we pronounce those words, so that's the pronunciation. And there's the way we put them together, our grammar and syntax, to communicate. Because if I was just throwing out random words right now, it wouldn't make any sense. I have to put them together in some kind of logical, reasonable order. Well, if we go back to Old English, all three of those elements were different. The vocabulary was different. I mean, we still have a lot of Old English words, but about 85% of the Old English vocabulary has been lost. The pronunciations were different, as we're going to talk about, quite different. And the vowels were often pronounced differently, and sometimes even the consonant sounds. And then, of course, the grammar was different. It was a highly inflected language. So whereas today we tend to rely more on word order to communicate meaning, in Old English relied more on suffixes that were attached to words, inflectional endings. So word order was much looser. And so it's a very different language. That's why I say when you listen to Old English, it doesn't even sound like English at all. But what happened is the big event, when Middle English really sort of began, or the triggering event, was the Norman Conquest, 1066. And it's such a major event in the history of England because it changed almost every aspect of English culture, including the language, because England is conquered by the Normans from northern France, so they speak French, Norman French, a particular dialect of French. And for the next 3 centuries or so, French basically becomes the official language of England. The nobility speaks it, the upper classes. It's a language of literature because French is so important on the continent. And so for about 3 centuries, we have this period when there's this massive influx of French words into the language. And as those French words came in, a lot of the Old English words started to disappear. So the vocabulary of the language starts to look more like modern English. When we look at a Middle English text, it looks more familiar to us because there's more familiar words. In fact, today, about a third of the English vocabulary comes from French, and about another third comes directly from Latin. Mm-hmm. So we're a very Latinate language today, even though we're not a Romance language. We're a Germanic language, but it's because of what happened after the Norman Conquest. So that changed. The other thing that changed was the grammar. All those inflectional endings, at least a lot of them, started to disappear, and we moved away from that. If you study another European language, you're going to encounter, grammatical gender. So it's the idea that every noun is masculine or feminine. Well, we don't really have that in English, but we did in Old English. But that started to disappear, and we came to rely more on word order to convey meaning. So we have subject, then verb, then object. We didn't rely on those suffixes anymore. So the grammar of Middle English starts to look like modern English. So on the page, if we look at Middle English, and let's say Geoffrey Chaucer, who's the most well-known writer during the Middle English period, if we look at his writings, his poetry, for example, it looks a lot like modern English or strongly resembles it because of those two changes. But that third factor that I mentioned, the pronunciation, had not changed yet for the most part. And so Middle English, that's the one feature that's lagging. And so when I think about Middle English, I think of a language, a period of time in the language when the vocabulary was becoming more like English, becoming more French, more Latinate, and the grammar was becoming more like English, but the pronunciation was still the older pronunciation. Mm-hmm. And what really happens at the end of the Middle English period, let's say in the late 1400s, 1500s, that third element changes. So the pronunciation starts to come more in line with modern English, and much of it happens due to something called the Great Vowel Shift, where there was kind of a wholesale change in the way the long vowel sounds were pronounced in English, and we can talk more about that later. But you have that, and also some changes in the way consonants were pronounced. And so that kind of bookends the Middle English period. So we begin with the changing in grammar and vocabulary, and we end with the changing in the pronunciation.
How do we know how Middle English sounded like? We don't have any recordings from that period, so what clues do we have?
So you have to piece it together from various, pieces of evidence. One of the key things, and this is very difficult for modern English speakers to relate to or understand, but prior to the modern English period, so let's say before the 1500s and 1600s, English spelling was largely phonetic. The first dictionaries don't really appear until the early 1600s, and the first spelling guides. So the idea that there's a standard way of spelling a word, there's a right or wrong way of spelling a word, didn't really exist prior to that point. That's a more modern concept. Prior to that point, people had to spell words like they sounded and spell them as best they could. And at the time, the letters of the alphabet tended to represent specific sounds because English adopted the alphabet from Latin. And within Latin, the alphabet had specific sounds. The letters had specific sounds. So they just applied that to English. English had some unique sounds, so they had to invent some new letters early on, and most of those died out. But again, it was phonetic, and it's difficult. It makes it difficult to read Old and Middle English texts because you don't have standard spellings. But it's wonderful if you're trying to recreate the pronunciations because you see how people pronounced them. And in fact, you see regional variations. Scribes writing in southern England tended to spell the same words the same, but they spelled them differently from scribes writing in northern England or scribes writing in the West Country or different parts of England. And you can pick up from those differences local regional accents. So it's really fascinating. So that's part of the answer, is just going back to a time when spelling was more phonetic. Occasionally, you also had writers and scribes who would mention the way the language was pronounced, sometimes comparing English to French or English to Latin in the way certain words were pronounced. So that's helpful. And then you also occasionally have writers who wrote rhyming poetry. Rhymes are very important because much of the surviving literature we have from the Middle English period is poetry, a large portion of it, and a lot of it was written in rhyming verse. And so if two words are rhyming, they have the same or pretty much the same vowel sound. Well, a lot of times they don't have the same vowel sound today. So that helps reconstruct the sound of certain vowels. Puns kind of work the same way. When writers are making puns with two words, they often pronounce the same or very similarly. And then by the time you get into the 1500s and 1600s, you actually have writers who are writing about the language and the way it sounds. And they say, well, this is in very detail, because they were trying to create a more standardized phonetic alphabet. And they were saying, this is, how we pronounce all these words. And they actually have long list, a word list and how they were all pronounced phonetically. So that helps. And then also historical linguists are able to compare how vowel sounds evolve. So we know that, for example, the long A sound in English began as an ah sound, which we still have in words like father or the word what or swan. It's still there, but most of the time it represents an A sound today, like cake and bake and same and so on. But we know that to get from ah to a, that's pronounced very differently in the mouth. The tongue has to do completely different shapes. So it had to evolve over time. So it would have gone from ah to a to e to a. So it takes a while to get there. So we know based on that if we're looking at a period of time in between, the sound would have had to have been somewhere in between. So there's a lot of these ways in which historical linguists piece this information together. And now's a good time for me to inform your listeners that I'm not a historical linguist. I'm actually an attorney by trade, but I also always try to make that clear. So when I talk about this, I'm trying to explain what the proper experts do when they reconstruct the sound of Middle English.
That's fascinating. We are going to return to that because we're going to do a little bit on the phonetics. We've got a little exercise for you later. But before we do that, Kevin is going to read out the part of the prologue to the Canterbury Tales in Middle English and in Modern English. And before we do that, I think it would be good to look just at a few pieces of vocabulary that crop up so that you'll recognize them when you start reading. Eke. Is that the same as to eke out something, to eke out a living?
It may very well be. The word actually meant also in the context of the Canterbury Tales and the way Chaucer used it here. And so in the way we use the word today, it means to lengthen or stretch out. So if we, eke out a living, or we eke something out, we're stretching it out. So they both words have that similar sense of, adding to or addition. The ultimate historical connection is unclear. Some sources say that they ultimately come from the same Germanic root word, but both versions were used in Old English and Middle English. And again, I'll say the connection between them is probable but unclear.
Okay. My next on my list is Strondus. I don't know how you say that.
Strondus. Yeah. Strondus. So this is actually the word strand, which meant a shoreline in Middle English. So the coastline or the shoreline was the strand. That actually still exists. We still use the word that way sometimes. Here in the United States, the coastline of South Carolina is sometimes called the Grand Strand. It's kind of a marketing term, but it's the same word. It's referring to the ocean, the coastline or ocean line.
Okay. Well, I'm from London, and the main street, one of the main streets running along the Thames, is called the Strand. So
there you go. Yeah. Very same idea.
Next, we have befill. Is that the same verb as, this is befallen? Is that the...
Yeah. It's just an early version. It befell. Again, the spelling of it in this poem throws it off a little bit, but it's just an early version of befell or befallen.
Okay, so this has befallen to me. This happened to me, kind of thing.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it happened. Befell that in that season on a day. So yeah, it happened on that day.
So you could so I could say befell that I was walking down the road and I got struck by lightning. You could.
Yeah.
Okay. And the next one which crops up quite a lot is devise. Is that how you say it?
Devise. It means to devise. So it's just an early version of the word devise.
Okay.
So I mentioned I'm an attorney. So in drafting a will, we might say that someone devises their property to someone else. But you might also devise a plan or a scheme to carry out some sinister deed. And it gets to the idea of kind of designing or arranging or planning something in detail. And here it's used in the sense Chaucer says that he's going to basically set out in detail what happened. Because the Canterbury Tales, you have a group of pilgrims meeting in southern south of the River Thames in London.
You pronounce it
at
perfectly,
an
actually.
inn.
That's very rare.
Thank you very much.
It's
It's probably not the way Chaucer pronounced it, which is actually mentioned in this poem. So we'll see when I get there.
Okay.
But yeah, they all meet at the Tabard Inn, and they're going to tell tales. Each of the pilgrims, they're on their way to Canterbury, and they're going to tell each other tales along the way. And he says he's going to explain and kind of detail what happened. So when he says there is you devise is literally what he says here, but he says basically what he's saying is I'm going to explain it to you in detail.
Okay. And finally in this section, anon, which seems to turn up a lot in the works of...
It does. You find that a lot. It's literally on one, but it means... at once is really what it means. So I'm going to tell you something anon means I'm going to do it right now. It means immediately, at once. The term at once meant at one time only. So I'm not going to do it occasionally or later. I'm going to do it this one time. And it kind of acquired that sense of right now, let's get to it, that kind of thing. So anon is literally at one, or
and is that
at
the
once.
same anon? Is it still a greeting? Like you hear people sometimes saying "see you anon." Is that the same anon?
If you hear that today, I suppose it is. I'm honestly I'm not sure though.
Okay. Well, now it's over to you. If you'd like to go ahead.
Sure. Well, what I'm reading here is the opening lines of the opening prologue of the Canterbury Tales. So this is one of the most famous passages in all of Middle English, probably the most famous passage in all of Middle English. And I'm going to read it initially in Middle English, or at least my version of it as best that I can recreate. When I do this in the podcast, sometimes I read through it 2 or 3 times and take the best reading, but we're going to do this one time, so I'll try to do as best I can. But you're going to hear, I think as I read through it, that it kind of sounds a bit like modern English, but not quite. The vowel sounds are different. There will be some different consonant sounds you'll hear, but what tends to happen over time is your ear kind of starts to adjust to it over time, and it starts to sound more and more familiar, like someone speaking English with a weird accent. So that's kind of what we're listening to. So here it goes. Juan that April with his shore sota, the druchte marcheth perse to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flour. When Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heath, the tender croppice and the young sun, hath in the ram his have course I runna, and small foolis maken melodia, that slepen all the nicht with open ear. So pricketh him nature and hear courages, that longen folk to gone on pilgrimages, and pomerus for to seken strong strandus, to ferne halles, cutha in sondry londes, and specially from every sheerest enda, of England to Canterbury they wenda, the holy blissful martyr for to seka, that hem hath holpen when that they were seka. Befell that in that season on a day, in Southwark at the Tabard as he lay, ready to wenden on me pilgrimage, to Canterbury with full devout courage. At nicht were come into that hostilleria, well 29 in a compania, of sundry folk be adventure falla, in fellowship and pilgrimes were they all, that toward Canterbury wolden reade, the chambers and the stables wherein weede. And well we weren asaid at the best, and shortly when the sun was to rest. So had he spoken with him every chone, that he was of here fellowship anon, and mad forward early for Teresa, to tuck our way there as he you devisa. But natheless will he have team and space, ere that he feather in this tall passa. Methinketh it accord down to reason, to tell you all the condition of each of them, so as it seemed may, and which they weren, and of what degree, and eke and what rye that they were in, and at a knecht then will he first begin.
It's more difficult to listen than to read. Am I right?
Right. Exactly. That's what I was saying earlier, because during the Middle English period, the version of the language that you find on the page starts to look more like modern English because of the vocabulary changes and the grammatical changes. Where you really break from modern English is the pronunciation. That's where it takes some getting used to and adjustment, and why it's easier to read, as you said, read along with it than just to listen to it.
Would you mind reading the modern version?
Sure. I'll try to do it. You know, we've got some words in here that aren't really, as you've already alluded to, modern words. So I'll try to do as best I can.
Okay.
And notice too that the way I read it, it was rhyming poetry, right? This isn't going to rhyme as well. When that April with his showers sweet, the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in such liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower. When Zephyrus also with his sweet breath inspired hath in every holt and heath the tender crops and the young sun, hath in the ram his half-course run, and small fowls make melody that sleep all the night with open eye. So pricketh them nature in their courages or hearts. Then long folk to go on pilgrimages. In other words, then people long to go on pilgrimages. And palmers for to seek strange strands. To ferna hollows, which means far off shrines, known in sundry lands. And specially from every shire's end, of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, that them hath helped when that they were sick. In other words, that them he helped when they were sick. Befell that in that season on a day, in Southwark at the Tabard as I lay, ready to wend on my pilgrimage, to Canterbury with full devout courage, meaning heart. At night were come into that hostel or inn, well 29 in a company, of sundry folk by adventure fall, in other words, by chance fallen, in fellowship and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury they would ride. The chambers and the stables were wide. And well we were eased at our best, in other words, we were put to ease in the best way. And shortly when the sun was to rest, so had I spoken with them every one, that I was of their fellowship anon, or at once, and made forward early for to rise, to take our way there as I you devise, in other words, as I will tell you. But nevertheless, while I have time and space, ere that I further in this tale pace, in other words, before I proceed further with this tale, methinketh it accordant to reason, to tell you all the condition of each of them, so as it seemed me, and which they were and of what degree, and eke, or also, in what array that they were in. And at a night, then will I first begin. And that leads into the Knight's Tale, which is the first tale of the Canterbury Tales.
Okay, and a night wouldn't have been pronounced night, as you said. It was
right.
The K and the G. It's the
right. It's one of my favorite examples of how the language has changed, because you have the pronunciation would have been knicht.
Knicht.
So today we have, that's what, 6 letters in that word. We really only need 3 of them today, the N, the I, and the T. But in Middle English, the thing that's great about Middle English is that the spelling, as I said, was more phonetic. And your listeners may say, well, why, who cares about all this stuff, several centuries ago? The reason why it's relevant to modern English is that it explains why a lot of words are spelled the way they are today. Because for the most part, our words reflect the way they were pronounced in the 1500s. So and that's at the very end of the Middle English period. So for all the frustration that people have when trying to figure out how to spell words, you have to understand that you're having to account for about 5 centuries of change since then. But if we go back in time and look at the way words were pronounced in late Middle English, suddenly spelling makes sense. So a word like night, K-N-I-G-H-T, makes sense because there was a K sound at the front, then an N. The I sound would have been different. It would have been more E, but we have that vowel there. The GH in the middle reflects the ch or ch sound, which has largely disappeared from the language. You still find it in some regional dialects. In Scotland, you have, lach still exists. But for the most part, that sound disappeared, and it left English with a lot of words that have a silent GH in the middle, like light and might and though, T-H-O-U-G-H. But that sound disappeared, and then you have, of course, the T at the end. So it's a good example of how modern spelling reflects the way words were pronounced in late Middle English, not necessarily the way they're pronounced today.
So what you're saying is when you open a dictionary, you're actually entering a museum rather than reading the phonetics of today's language.
It's exactly right. And this is an important point that I like to make, because there are always people who complain about English spelling, and rightfully so. Modern English spelling is a bit crazy.
I'm going to raise my hand on that one. All the traumas I had at school.
Absolutely. I think very few people would argue with this. Very few people. When people talk about how crazy English is, it's not the grammar. English grammar is pretty basic and simple, really, compared to most other language. It's the spelling. That's really what they're referring to. And it's because English pronunciation has changed so much over the past 5 centuries, but we've never had any major spelling reform. No. Whereas other languages have. Other languages have tended to reform their spelling along the way. So we have this spelling system today that isn't phonetic based on the way words are pronounced today. But as you said, English spelling is like a time capsule. It captures the state of the language in the distant past. And if you learn a little bit about that distant past and the way words were and vowels and consonants were pronounced, not only does it make the spelling make more sense, more logical, but it also just it ties you and connects you back to that history, which is, I think, very important. And it gives you new insight into the language, that the language we're speaking is old. It's been around for a long time. It's changed, and it isn't necessarily the way we communicate today. And language is always changing, so it will be different a century from now than it is today. But it's important to understand there is a reason why most words are spelled the way they are, and it has to do with the way they were pronounced in late Middle English.
Good to know. It gives me some solace of somebody who's not a great speller. You gave me a few other words, Kevin, that may be interesting, that shed some light on Middle English pronunciation. Aprile, the first one.
Sure. Well, yeah, that's April, our month of April. So it begins when April, with his showers, sutta, as it said there, shora sutta. So I could probably spend half an hour just on this one sentence. There's so much going on. But let's just quickly note that, as I mentioned earlier, the long vowel sounds in English shifted and changed as part of what's called the Great Vowel Shift that occurred from the 1400s primarily through the 1600s, and you can argue that it lasted even beyond that a little bit. It was a wholesale change in the way the vowel sounds, the long vowel sounds in English, were pronounced. So when I say the long vowel sounds, it's really the sounds of the letters themselves, A, E, I, O, U. those are your long vowel sounds, as opposed to a, I, e, which are the short sounds. But anyway, those changed, and they did it kind of like a game of musical chairs, where they all moved around in relation to each other. And the idea of a vowel shift is a little bit confusing to people, but it's basically just how accents develop or change over time, where people just start pronouncing words differently than they pronounced them before, and they have a different vowel sound. And this happens gradually, and it begins with a few speakers, maybe 5% of the speakers say it that way, and then it grows to 10, 20, 30, and eventually more than half of the people are pronouncing it that way. And then over time, that becomes the standard pronunciation. So it's something that happens gradually. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's a slow, persistent change that happens. And that's what we're talking about when we say there was a vowel shift. Over time, more and more people changed the way they pronounce these words. So the A sound was originally that ah sound. I mentioned words like father and swan, that type of thing. Today it's a, so it's changed from ah to a, and that word there's a good example because April would have had that ah sound during the time of Chaucer. Now it has the a sound, April. But then we go on in that line, and he says with his chorus sota. Why does he say his when referring to April? April's a month. It's not a person. Well, the word it's used to, that third person pronoun form to show possession. Okay. It's didn't exist in Middle English. It didn't occur until early modern English around the time of Shakespeare. So if you were referring to an inanimate object, you had to use his. The same, masculine pronoun form was used. If I was referring to leaves on a tree, I would refer to his leaves, the tree's leaves. So here, his showers is referring back to April. And we have showers sweet. Well, today we would say sweet showers. But remember, this is the French influence. In French, the adjective often follows the noun. And you see that influence here as well, shower sota. And sota, S-O-O-T-E, here is the word sweet. There were two slightly different versions of that word in Middle English. One had the W sound, one didn't. Chaucer used the one here that didn't because it rhymed with root in the next line, sota and rota. But the other version that we have today with the W sound also existed. So again, within that line, you can see there's so much going on in Middle English if you dig into it a little bit.
Well, we can still sometimes, for literary, poetic reasons, put the adjective afterwards. I'm thinking of in 1492, right. Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Ocean blue.
Or something like that.
And some of these old forms persist in poetry. And another good example of this, and this may be obvious, but today, we have the pronoun form you, while we're talking about pronoun forms. You is our wonderful generic second person pronoun. We just use it everywhere. We use it if I'm referring to one person, it's you. If I'm referring to a group of people, it's you. If it's the subject of the sentence, you look great today. Or if it's the object of the sentence, he was looking at you. So the point is, it's you. But in Old English, in Middle English, you still had various forms, including the word thou. Thou was the singular form, as opposed to you. You was the plural form. And over time, of course, thou disappears. It starts to disappear at the end of the Middle English period into the modern period. But we still use thou in poetry. It's still common. We find it occasionally. And so it's another good example of how these older word forms still linger in poetry, in verse today.
Can we focus a little bit on the phonology? Because we've got a little exercise for the viewers in a moment. This is just for my research. You sound the final E on many words. So courage,
right.
Is that correct?
It is. It's variable, though. The story of that E at the end is fascinating in and of itself. I mentioned earlier that the grammatical differences between Old English and Modern English. And I mentioned that the major difference is that Old English was highly inflected. It had a lot of suffixes that conveyed all the grammatical information. So you didn't have to use the same word order. You didn't even have to use any particular word order because those suffixes gave all that information. And I noted that during the Middle English period, those suffixes started to erode, and we replaced that with a more specific word order. Well, those endings didn't just suddenly disappear overnight. What happened is they kind of got worn down into a very generic at the end of many words. So what in Old English you might have had and and in and en and different versions. By the time you get to the 1300s, it's become just a It just happens at the end of words. So in those first lines, sota, rota, sonna, ronna, melodia, openi, I mean, well, that's I, but you get it. You have a lot of those silent E's at the end, but we know that they weren't always pronounced. They were generally pronounced. And the reason why we kind of know they weren't always pronounced is because Geoffrey Chaucer, for example, wrote in iambic pentameter. He's one of the really the first English poets to use iambic pentameter, which later we associate with William Shakespeare and other writers. Well, iambic pentameter requires a certain rhythm. It's the 5 beats, what we sometimes call the heartbeats, da-dum, 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 in each line. And we know using that rhythm that sometimes that E was pronounced to give us that final little beat, and sometimes it wasn't. And that's helpful in terms of telling us whether or not it was pronounced. But by the time you get to the end of the Old English period, so let's say a century after Chaucer was writing, he's writing in the late 1300s, so let's say the late 1400s, we know those E's were mostly silent. Every bit of evidence we have. In fact, they were disappearing in spelling. Interestingly, it does still linger in modern English because we still have a lot of silent E's on the end of words, but they survived as a spelling technique. I referred to all those long vowel sounds that moved around during the early modern period. Well, scribes and printers started to use that silent E as a way of marking the vowel sound. So if a word had the long vowel sound, they would just leave the silent E on the end. If it didn't have the long vowel sound, they would take it off. So you have hat without the E, that's the short A, and hate with the E, right? Cap, cape. You can kind of go on and on and on forever doing that. But yeah, that silent E today is just used as a way of indicating vowel length or vowel sound, but it lingers from this period in Middle English when it still was at the end of many words and was still pronounced as kind of an sound.
Okay, that's fascinating. I've got here, so A-L-L-E would have been pronounced Ala. You would have said that.
Ala.
Ala.
And by the way, those silent E's, one of the reasons why they lingered even after people stopped pronouncing them is because printers also loved those silent E's. In early printing, the lines of the text were usually justified, so they were even on both sides. And if you were a printer trying to justify the margins, those silent E's really came in handy because sometimes the E was included, sometimes it wasn't. If you needed to stretch out the line, you could just add in some of those silent E's. If you needed to shorten the line, you could just take them out. So that's part of the reason why they kept lingering in the language even after they stopped being pronounced.
Okay. I've got down here that the I sound in words like white becomes an E sound, so wheater would be white.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's actually believed to be one of the first vowel sounds that changed during the Great Vowel Shift. It's one of the first ones that seems to be clearly documented. And so we see that happening in as early as the 1400s. So shortly after Chaucer died, really, we start to see evidence of that. But during his lifetime, there really isn't any widespread evidence of it. So he was writing at the very end of the period when the old pronunciation was used. Interestingly, what happens is with the I sound itself, let's say originally the letter I was the E sound. Okay, so we still have that in English. If we think of a word like ski, I'm going to go skiing, or pizza, or piano or elite. We still have that sound. Today, we mostly have it in words that have been borrowed from French or other languages in more recent centuries after the Great Vowel Shift occurred. But that sound under the Great Vowel Shift evolved into, of course, our modern I sound. So it went from E and then probably was more of an A and then I. And the modern sound is called a diphthong because it's two sounds put together. It's an ah and an E, I. While that sound was moving out of the way, though, another sound was moving into its place, because remember, the Great Vowel Shift is like a big game of musical chairs where all the sounds are shifting around. And the sound that moved into that position was the A sound, which was traditionally represented by letter E. So that's why today we have so many words with the E sound are spelled with double E's. So seem, S-E-E-M, sea itself, S-E-E, tree, T-R-E-E. These are words spelled with double E's because those double E's represented a long vowel sound. That's why they doubled the letter. But it was originally A, and then it slid over into that E position. So that's another good example of how our spelling reflects the older pronunciation, the Middle English pronunciation.
So in modern words, so you mentioned seem, so that would have been like same, something like that. And
well, yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
And meat, as in the thing you eat, would be like mate. Is that right? Is that my understanding it correctly?
That's correct, yes. Mm-hmm. So this gets really complicated very quickly if we're not careful, but because you've got so many things happening simultaneously, right. So many vowel sounds shifting around in the Great Vowel Shift at the same time. But what we end up with is sometimes these vowels shifted over kind of one position to the vowel sound next door. And when I say next door, what we're talking about here, vowels, it's important to understand what a vowel is. We talk about vowels as if everybody understands the concept, but consonants usually involve some friction in the mouth. So a D or a T is, you've got tongue touching the teeth or the upper palate, or you've got K in the back where something's closing off. You've got friction, connection. Vowel sounds are pronounced in the open cavity of the mouth, and they're shaped by the tongue. So the sound you get in a vowel is determined by how high the front or the back of the tongue is. And so that's why we can move from one vowel to the other so easily. I can move between them just by moving my tongue. I can go A, I, O, U. I might round my lips a little bit at the end, but other than that, it's all shaped by tongue. And linguists who study this type of thing will notice that that's why I said earlier, the vowels shift in a certain order, because what's happening is over time is people maybe start just raising their tongue a little bit when they pronounce certain words. So that's shifting the vowel up. That's how you go from A to E. People just raise their tongue a little bit over time. And that's why these things kind of happen in some type of an order or sequence. And sometimes the vowel just shifted one time like that from A to E, but sometimes a vowel shifted more than once. So it made that kind of, if we're playing musical chairs, you move to not just the chair next to you, but the one next to that one. You move twice. And what happened is sometimes the vowels merged together. They collided and combined. And that's why we have so many homophones in English today, like see, S-E-E, I see you, and sea like the ocean, S-E-A. They're spelled differently because they once had different vowel sounds. The verb I see you would have been say. The other one, like the ocean, would have been say. It's a little lower vowel, but that vowel shifted twice and they kind of collided. And so we have a lot of words in English today where we have an EA and an EE spelling that rhyme. So meet, like I'm going to meet you later, versus meat, like you're going to have some meat for dinner, M-E-A-T. C and C, feet, like on my legs, F-E-E-T, and F-E-A-T, feet. We have a lot of these in English, and it's because they all kind of combine together as part of the Great Vowel Shift, but the spelling is reflecting the older Middle English pronunciations, which were distinct.
Okay. Am I right in assuming that what you're describing the GVS had a greater effect in London than in the north? Because I know, the north of England, in Yorkshire and Newcastle, they won't say mate as I do. From the south, they say mate, and they won't say stone as I do. They'll say
Right.
stone. Does that reflect an older pronunciation?
It does. And I can't say that every regional difference is based on that, but a lot of them are, because the great vowel shift, as its classical full version, as you would read about it if you had the desire to read a book on the great vowel shift and not fall asleep, it applied in its full form in the south of England. And that's really where standard English evolves, because what we consider to be standard English today is really the language of London and the area around London. But and that's really where the great vowel shift again affected all of the vowels, and we get all of the shifting that I talked about, including the multiple shifting. As you go further north, there was less of it. It still happened, but you don't have as much of the shifting going on. So like I mentioned, you have that sometimes the vowel shifted twice situation, which caused these sounds to combine and create all these homophones. Well, in the north of England, that didn't necessarily happen. You might have only got one of the shifts and not multiple shifts. And so that creates regional differences in dialects. And again, doesn't account for every regional accent and dialect difference, but it accounts for a lot of them.
Okay. I've just got one more thing about the phonology. Because I know in France, I live in France, and in French, when you see an OU, it's always pronounced U. And I'm thinking that the early scribes writing in English, that in Middle English was, when I say a word like house with an OU, was that pronounced hoose? Were they
Hoose.
mimicking
Yep.
the French? A moose? Was it moose?
It was hoose, and mouse was moose. It was the oo sound. So there's an interesting story about this, because the OU spelling that we have in English today was taken from French. It is a French influence on English. So again, French not only influenced English vocabulary by giving us so many words, but even spelling conventions used in French were adopted and brought over. In fact, many of our modern spellings reflect that. The fact that we use QU for a word like queen or quick comes from French. It was originally spelled with a C. But at any rate, this is another example of that.
Logical.
Yeah, exactly. So at any rate, what happens with the OU has to do with the handwriting that was used at the time during the middle and early modern period. And the script is very difficult to explain. You kind of have to see it, but it was like a form of calligraphy where you would have had a very straight, bold line with a little flourish at the top or bottom, so that it was very blocky. So if I'm writing in a letter I would just kind of do a straight, bold line, a little flourish at the bottom. If I'm doing a U, it's done the same way. It's like two I's next to each other. I do a straight line, a little flourish at the bottom, connecting the straight line. And a letter, M does the same thing in reverse. You've got three straight lines, a little flourish at the top connecting them, and N does the same thing. So what you end up with is this very blocky text that's difficult to read, and where an I, for example, tends to get lost. If I spelled the word minimum in that text, you get nothing but straight lines with little flourishes at the bottom or top, because they're all M, I, N, and so on. And again, U was one of those problems. It got lost. By the way, that's why the letter I has a little dot above it today. It was a way that scribes used to try to help people find where the I was, because it was so easy to get lost. Well, U also had that problem. U looked like two I's, and it would just, you couldn't find it in a text. So the French had adopted the technique of spelling the oo sound. And by the way, letter U was the letter that was used for the oo sound. That's the traditional letter of the sound going back to, that's the traditional sound of letter U going back to Latin. So that was what was used in Old and Early Middle English. But then scribes said, well, we can adopt this French technique of using OU, because that O will break up the line and it makes it easier to find that U. And so a word like house went from HUS to HOUS, and the same thing with mouse and so on. And so that spelling change happened first. Then the great vowel shift kicked in. And in the 1400s, 1500s, we start to get the changing of the vowel. And the vowel goes from U to O, kind of initially, and then ends off in the 1700s as ow. So we go from hoose, house, house, and moose, mouse, mouse. And there are still accents of English that use that middle pronunciation. You'll hear people say house and mouse. Probably in some parts of England. I know parts of Canada you'll hear that. I grew up in eastern North Carolina, where there's a very distinct accent spoken along the coast by people who settled there 2 or 3 centuries ago and were isolated. So they never completed the great vowel shift, and they still say house and mose. In fact, when I was in school, my last name is Stroud, spelled with one of those OUs, and one of my teachers called me Kevin Stroud because they had that pronunciation. So that middle stage is still in English if we look for it, but for the most part, the sound continued to evolve into the ow sound that we use today.
And you get that cliched Canadian pronunciation of about and oot.
About. And people, I think, misrepresent it as a boot. I would say, I think most Canadians would probably agree that it's not really a boot, though I have heard that. Some Canadians say that, but I think the more common pronunciation is more that about. It's more in that it's more in that middle range between oo and ow, but at any rate, it does appear to be kind of a lingering. Sometimes it's difficult to know in a pronunciation like that whether it's a holdover from the past or it's something that's developed more recently. I think most linguists would say that it's more of a holdover from the past in Canadian English.
Okay, and I'm guessing the great vowel shift is also responsible for the double O's, the moon and book, food, blood. They're all good.
It is in part. Those are tricky because you really have those words have undergone tremendous change over time. So we have so many words today spelled with double O's that all would have had the O sound in Middle English, because again, that's how you represented the long vowel sound very often, was by doubling the letter as just a simple technique. So when we encounter a word, whether it's moon with the oo sound, would have been moan, or a word like good has the oo sound, would have been goad, and a word like flood would have been flowed. Even though you have 3 different vowel sounds today, they all had the same vowel sound initially. It was that O sound. And what happened again is differing changes over time. Initially, there was that shift under the great vowel shift from O to U. So that's what brought all those, most of those words today that have the double O's have the U sound. So moon, soon, food, broom, so on, room. Mm-hmm. But then there were some separate changes that happened around the same time where the vowel was shortened. So it went from the long U sound to a short U sound. And that's when you get words like book and foot and good. And then a little bit later, there was another shift from U to which affected really only a couple of words. I think it's blood and flood. I think those are probably the only double O words that show that second or third or fourth change, however how you want to count them. So yeah, those words today are a bit of a mess, and that's why I say modern English spelling is a bit of a mess, because the same spelling represents so many different vowel sounds. But again, if we go back to Middle English, we would find they all had the same sound. They were all pronounced with the same O sound.
So the GH was pronounced, so nicht, knicht, drochte, drought. Is that what it means?
Yeah, that's drought. Yeah, drucht.
Drucht. Mm-hmm. Also nature.
Natur. So, yeah, what's happened today is we have a lot of words where the T in certain situations and the S in certain situations has become a sibilant sound. So it's changed from the nature of the consonant. So nature, the way we pronounce it, it's Nature, but we pronounce it with more of a CH sound. Nature. That had not happened yet. It happened really more in the late 1500s, early 1600s time frame. So it would have still been pronounced as a T with a U. So nature, nature. Same thing happens with a lot of words with an S in the middle, like measure, pleasure. We pronounce those words with a zh sound today, but that again didn't happen until later. So it would have been mesure, pleasure. So what we find is a lot of these common pronunciations of even consonants had not occurred yet. So we tend to focus on the great vowel shift and the differences in the vowel sounds, but very often the consonants were even pronounced differently at one time.
Okay, I'm thinking also differences in American and British English with a TU, like I'd say tuna and tune, and I think in American it's still a two.
Yeah, it's the same phenomenon. In that case, extended over to the initial sound. It happens where you have one of these consonant sounds, typically a T or an S, followed by kind of an E or ye sound. So a sound normally associated with either the beginning of an I or sometimes the beginning of a U, because we say U, but U actually begins with a little Y sound at the front. We don't say the European U, we say the English U. So that's the trigger for these changes. It's the I or the U. So it happens in an environment where you have like an S or a T followed by an I or U. That sometimes are different, but that's often the trigger for the sound change.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. Got a little exercise now. I was thinking, wouldn't it be fun if you could go out into the street to your bakery with your dentist and use Middle English pronunciation? Or maybe you already do that, Kevin. I don't know.
I do not.
Okay. But I'm encouraging everyone to do that, because I've got a little exercise. I've just got some modern phrases, and I'm just wondering how they would be pronounced following the Middle English pronunciation. Because also you said that it's more phonetic, so in a way it should be easier for an outsider to do than learn modern English.
Yeah, because you're basically it's just a phonetic pronunciation. Yeah. So if you know what the sound of the letters, what they were in Middle English, then it's pretty simple.
Okay, so what I'll do, I'll say it in modern English, then I'll leave a pause so the viewer can try and pronounce it in Middle English, and then if you wouldn't mind, Kevin, you can say it in Middle English. Is that okay?
Okay.
All right. First one is, what's your name?
What's your name? So the key there is the R is probably trilled a little bit in your. So Middle English was rhotic, unlike modern British English in the south of England especially, in most of England today really, is non-rhotic, so the vowel sound, the R sound is often dropped after a vowel, but that was not the case in Middle English. It was pronounced. So, and it was probably more of a trilled R than the modern R sound that we have.
A Spanish R.
Correct. And so, your would have been your, little trill or tap at the end. Name, again, we have that original long vowel sound before the great vowel shift, so nam. And then E at the end would have generally been pronounced until the end of the Middle English period, so it's nama.
Nama. So, could you say it again, please?
What's your nama?
What's your nama? Did I do okay?
Right. Yeah, I think you did better than I did, actually.
I guess that needs a reply. So my name, I'll say it in modern English. My name is Gideon.
Mi Name is Kevin.
Okay, mi name.
So again, the same thing. Now, the difference there is in the word my,
Okay.
which would have been me. The Y represented a very unique sound that we really don't have in English anymore. It was basically like saying, it's basically the French U sound in a word like tu. It's the U sound. So you basically say E, but you round your lips when you do it. E. So that's technically the sound of Y. But as that sound disappeared, that's another, not part of the Great Vowel Shift, but it's another sound change in Middle English. As it disappeared, it tended to become just an E sound initially. So it fell in with the pronunciation of letter I, which remember, it was also originally pronounced as E. And that's why today in modern English, we kind of use Y and I interchangeably. I think British English tends to spell the word tire with a Y, and American English spells it with an I. But it's just a good example of how they've become somewhat interchangeable. So, but the older pronunciation again would have been me. Let's say the late Middle English pronunciation would have been me instead of my. Again, a pronunciation you can still hear in many parts of the British Isles to this day.
Mi name is Gideon.
Right.
Okay. Right. Where are you from?
I don't think that's much different than today. Where are you from?
The R.
So a little trill of the R.
Yeah.
Yeah, the little trill on the R. I think for the most part, those words were pronounced the same. Now, U is interesting because we just talked about the OU in so many of these words became owl, right? House and mouse and about. But U didn't change. And it's one of these these vowel changes don't always affect every word. Sometimes there are stragglers left behind. And the reason why U probably didn't change is because it's such a common word. Words that we use in almost every other sentence, they become so ingrained, their pronunciation, that they become a bit conservative. They don't tend to change as much. And the best example I can give you of that is the other version of you that I mentioned earlier, thou. Notice it's also spelled with OU. So you've got YOU and THOU. One is pronounced with you, and the other's got the ow sound, thou. Well, that's because thou was disappearing from the language, and so it fell in with all the other words. But you was such a common dominant pronoun form, and as I mentioned earlier, we use it everywhere today, that it just apparently just held on to that original pronunciation.
Okay.
By the way, I should mention that we do have a few other words in English that have where the OU has the oo sound, like soup and souvenir and moose
from
and
French.
acoustic
Is
and group. What do all of those words have in common? They're French loan words that came in after the Great Vowel Shift. They came in during the 1700s and 1800s after all these changes had occurred. So we still hang on to that original French pronunciation. So again, another example of why modern English spelling is a bit of a nightmare, but it's helpful if you know where the word came from and how it was once pronounced.
A good reason to study etymology as well.
Exactly.
Okay, well, so I just need to say the R's properly, which is difficult for me because my accent is non-Russian. Where are you from?
I think that's
Where art
perfect.
thou
I love that. That's better than I did, actually.
Okay, so this is quite good. You could use this if you're meeting, like, if you bump into an interesting stranger. You can start speaking to them in Middle English. I think it could
exactly.
Let us know how that goes in the comments.
Yeah. Could go either way.
Shall we meet tonight?
Shall we meet tonight?
Oh.
So shall we, W-E, so the E originally had the A sound, we. Meet, we see those double E's in there. Remember, that was another way of representing the long sound of the letter, which was originally A, so met. And tonight, tonight.
Shall we meet tonight?
Yeah,
right.
That's
so
it.
I'm going to stand out on the street corner to see how that goes. All right.
I think you're crazy, but okay.
Now this one We've gone through this one, so it should be easy. There's a mouse in the house.
There's a moose in the house.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I got to remember the R. There's a moose in the house.
Correct.
Okay, right. And another one to meet when you meet a stranger. Would you like to get a coffee?
This was tricky because coffee is a modern English word, at least in at least in modern English. The word is older than modern English, but within English, it came in after the Great Vowel Shift. So, let me think. Would you like to get a coffee? Something like that. The interesting thing there is the word would, W-U-L-D. The L was pronounced at one time. It disappeared in the 1500s and 1600s. So the OU is the U sound, right? Would, that's kind of hard to say. Would is probably why the L disappeared. Would you like to get a coffee?
Would you
Something like that.
to get a coffee with me?
Right.
Have you seen the price of eggs? It's outrageous.
Ooh. Have you seen the price of eggs? It's outrageous. Yeah, that's it. It's outrageous. Outrageous. Yeah, outrageous.
I think I prefer that pronunciation, actually. Outrageous.
Yeah. The interesting thing there is the word eggs, which I said eggs. I think you could also say eggis.
Eggis.
Probably would have been a little better pronunciation, giving the S a distinct syllable at the end. Eggs, as you probably know, is part of a famous story recounted by William Caxton, who was the first printer in England. And he comes over in the late 1400s, and he struggles with this idea about what version of a word to use in his text. And he gives the example of the word eggs, and he tells the story of two men from the north of England. By the way, the key to this story is that eggs is the version of the word that was used in the north of England. It's a northern word. Erin was the southern version of the word. So, and by the way, eggs comes from Old Norse. So this ties back to the Vikings and the fact that the Vikings had invaded and conquered, most of northern England during the Viking period, which was late Old English. So he tells the story of these two northerners who are headed across the channel, and they're down in Kent, and they're hungry, and they ask a woman for eggs, and she doesn't know what eggs means, and she says she thinks they speak French, because again, French was so prominent at the time, and she doesn't give them eggs because she doesn't know what they're asking for, and he asks the question, what word should I use? Should I use eggs or irin? And so it is a challenge at the time, particularly in the late 1400s and 1500s, because people in the south of England didn't recognize northern versions of the words, and as his story tells us, they sometimes even confused it with French or some other language.
Okay, so that's an Old Norse word used in the north of England, eggs, which is basically what we use today.
And became the common form over time and replaced the southern form, which did sometimes happen.
I've got one more phrase, and I've got a reason for including this one, because as I'm from London, and a typical London phrase is a bottle of water, with lots of glottal stops. And I was curious to know how my ancestors, well, not all of them were from London, but would have said a bottle of water.
A bottle of water.
A bottle of water.
So the T's would have been pronounced, yeah.
Okay, and the R's at the end of water, water.
Water. Yeah, probably trilled. There's a period in late Middle English where the R at the end of words is probably evolving into the modern R. So some people would have trilled it, and some people would have used the more modern version. So some would have said water, and some people would have said water. But a bottle of water.
Bottle of water. I can try that.
Because again, remember, spelling is much more phonetic than if we account for the way things were pronounced in the past. So when we see these T's, in the middle of words, they were pronounced as T's. You mentioned the glottal stop, which is common in London English and in parts of southern England. American English changed it in a different way. American English changed a lot of those medial T's into D sounds. So American English will often say bottle instead of bottle, and will say water instead of water. Of course, you also hear different vowel sound, water, water, different versions of that. But those medial T's are tricky because they can either be pronounced as T's or D's or dropped altogether today.
So, I'll put a link to all the text in the comments, and just would like to thank Kevin. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been so fascinating to have you join today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. I've enjoyed it.
I guess we could just finish by, how would I say goodbye or see you in Middle English?
Farewell.
Farewell. Okay, well, thanks once again, Kevin. Farewell.
All right. Thanks.